Hey dreamers, tonight we journey into the heart of one of the ancient world's most haunting love stories, one that dares to ask, what happens when a mortal falls in love with a god? A story where curiosity becomes both the spark of passion and the cause of ruin. This is the tale of Eros and Psyche, a love that defied Olympus itself, that cost a princess everything she knew, and gave her something far greater in return. And here's the mystery. Why did the goddess of love herself, Aphrodite, turn her fury against a mortal girl who never sought her throne? What secret did Psyche uncover that even the gods tried to keep hidden? And how could the act of simply looking at her lover's face unleash the wrath of heaven itself? Tonight, we'll uncover what truly happens when trust breaks, when beauty becomes a curse, and when even the gods learn that love can wound deeper than any arrow. Before you settle in, take a breath. Like the world around you is fading to silence, and if these nightly journeys help you drift a little closer to rest, don't forget to like and subscribe. It means more than you know. Now let the world around you grow quiet and soft. Let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift back through the mists of time, to an age when the line between mortal and divine was thin as silk, when gods walked unseen among humans, and when a single act of love or defiance could change a life forever. Our story begins in a kingdom whose name has long been lost to history, a land of sun-warmed stone and olive groves, of marble columns and terraced vineyards that slid toward a glittering blue sea. There, a king and queen ruled with steady hands and fair hearts, blessed with 3 daughters whose beauty was the pride of their realm. The eldest 2 were graceful, admired, their names sung at festivals, and they knew their beauty would buy them comfort, alliances, and crown-worthy marriages. But the youngest, Psyche, was something else entirely. Her beauty didn't just turn heads, it stopped hearts. It was the kind of beauty that made poets forget their verses mid-line, that made priests lose their prayers, that made even the air seem to still when she walked past. Her face was flawless, yes, but that wasn't what unsettled people. There was something inside her that glowed outward, as though her very soul leaked light into the world. When she walked through the marketplace, merchants went silent mid-sentence. Travellers came from faraway lands not for trade, but just to glimpse her, waiting hours in the palace courtyard for the chance to see her move like moonlight through human form. Some swore that looking at Psyche felt like standing in a temple, like glimpsing a piece of the divine wearing mortal skin. And that's where the danger began. Because in the ancient world, to be too beautiful was not a gift, it was a threat. Whispers began to spread through the kingdom, quiet at first, then louder. She's not just beautiful, people said. She's more beautiful than Aphrodite herself. And that single comparison, careless, human, dangerous, would set in motion events that even the gods couldn't undo. But before we reach the fury of the goddess of love, there's something about Psyche's beauty, a small, forgotten detail that the poets never wrote down. Something that might explain why her radiance didn't just capture mortal hearts, but the attention of the gods themselves. We'll come back to that soon. The whispers grew to murmurs, and the murmurs grew to open declarations. People began to bring offerings to Psyche as she walked through the streets, flowers and small tokens of devotion that they would lay at her feet as one might lay offerings before a temple altar. They began to speak her name with the reverent tones usually reserved for prayers to the immortals. Some of the more fervent among them even built small shrines in her honor, decorating them with images and dedicating them to this new goddess of beauty who walked among them in mortal form. The consequences of this misguided worship were profound and far-reaching. The temples of Aphrodite, which had once been thronged with worshippers bringing sacrifices and prayers, stood increasingly empty and neglected. The altars grew cold, their fires unlit for lack of offerings. The incense burners remained empty, the air around Aphrodite's shrines no longer sweet with the smoke of burning myrrh and frankincense. The priests and priestesses who tended these sacred spaces found themselves with less and less to do, their days of constant ritual and ceremony replaced by long hours of waiting for worshippers who no longer came. And in the heavens above, in the golden palaces of Mount Olympus where the gods dwelt in their eternal splendor, Aphrodite became aware of what was transpiring in the mortal world below. the goddess of love and beauty, whose vanity was as legendary as her loveliness, felt the withdrawal of worship like a physical pain. Each prayer that went to Psyche instead of to her proper altar, each offering laid at mortal feet rather than before divine statues, each comparison that named the girl more beautiful than the goddess herself, these struck Aphrodite like blows to her pride and her power. For the gods, you must understand, were not sustained by ambrosia and nectar alone. They fed also on the worship of mortals, on the prayers and sacrifices and devotion that rose like sweet smoke from the altars below. To be forgotten, to have one's worship transferred to a mortal rival, was not merely insulting but existentially threatening in ways that mortals could scarcely comprehend. Aphrodite's rage, when it finally crystallized into action, was the cold and calculated fury of immortal power offended. She summoned her son Eros to her presence, calling him to the grand chamber where she held court, a room that embodied everything the goddess represented. The walls were mother of pearl that shimmered with colors that shifted between rose and silver and gold. The floor was polished marble, the color of sea foam inlaid with patterns of coral and lapis lazuli, depicting scenes of love and desire. The air itself seemed perfumed with roses and jasmine and other fragrances, more subtle and complex, scents that stirred longing and passion in all who breathed them. Eros appeared before his mother in his full divine glory, his great white wings folded against his back, his golden bow and quiver of arrows slung across his shoulder. He was beautiful, as all the gods were beautiful, but his beauty was of a particular kind, youthful and mischievous, the beauty of spring and new desire and all things fresh and untried. His eyes, which could see into the hearts of mortals and immortals alike, regarded his mother with affection and a certain wariness. For he knew well that when Aphrodite called for him with that particular tone in her voice, some mortal was about to find their life complicated by the interventions of divine will. "My son," Aphrodite said, her voice honey-sweet but with steel beneath the sweetness, "there is a mortal girl who has offended me greatly. Her name is Psyche, and she has allowed, perhaps even encouraged, humans to worship her as though she were divine, to compare her beauty favorably to mine, to neglect my altars in favor of adoring her. This insult cannot be permitted to continue." She outlined her plan with the casual cruelty that gods so often displayed when dealing with mortals who had somehow offended them. Eros was to go to this Psyche, this girl who dared to rival a goddess, and he was to use one of his special arrows, the ones that caused not love but revulsion. He was to make Psyche fall desperately and irrevocably in love with the most wretched, hideous creature he could find, some beast or monster or deformed wretch who would make her life a misery and serve as a warning to any other mortal who might think to compete with the immortals. Eros agreed, as he always did when his mother commanded, and he made his way down from Olympus to the mortal world, invisible to human eyes, traveling on his powerful wings toward the kingdom where Psyche dwelt. He found her in her chamber late at night, sleeping in her bed with moonlight streaming through the window to illuminate her peaceful face. Eros stood beside the bed, invisible and intent on his task, preparing to shoot Psyche with the arrow that would doom her to a love as wretched as his mother had demanded. But as he looked down at her sleeping form, as he studied her face in the moonlight, and saw not just the extraordinary physical beauty that had caused all this trouble, but something else, something in the gentle curve of her lips and the vulnerability of her closed eyes that spoke of kindness and innocence, something shifted within the god of love himself. Perhaps it was the way a strand of her dark hair had fallen across her cheek, or the way her hand lay curled on the pillow like a child's. Perhaps it was some quality he sensed in her sleeping soul, some essential goodness that even divine sight could barely comprehend. Or perhaps it was simply that Eros, who had spent eternity causing others to fall in love but who had never experienced that particular madness himself, was due for his own encounter with the irrational, overwhelming force of genuine passion. Whatever the cause, the result was catastrophic in the most wonderful and terrible way. As Eros leaned closer to better examine this mortal who had so troubled his mother, he accidentally pricked himself with one of his own arrows, the ones designed to cause instant and overwhelming love. The effect was immediate and irrevocable. Eros, the god who had never known romantic love, who had existed only to inspire it in others, fell completely and hopelessly in love with Psyche in that instant. The sensation must have been overwhelming for him, this sudden flood of desire and tenderness and longing that had no precedent in his divine existence. He stood there beside her bed, transfixed, unable to complete the task his mother had set him, unwilling now to do anything that might harm this mortal girl who had somehow, in a single moment, become more precious to him than anything else in all of creation. But Eros was not so lost to love that he forgot the danger Psyche was in. His mother's anger still needed to be addressed, some resolution still needed to be found. An idea began to form in his mind, a plan that was risky and complicated, but which might allow him to have what he wanted while still appearing to fulfill his mother's command. But it would require careful execution and perfect timing, and it would need to begin with ensuring that no mortal man could claim Psyche as his bride before Eros himself could put his plan into motion. Before he left her chamber that night, Eros used his powers to place a subtle enchantment upon Psyche, a working of divine will so delicate that even she would not be aware of it. From that moment forward, no mortal man would feel the stirrings of romantic love when he looked upon her. They would still see her beauty, would still be awed and overwhelmed by it, but that admiration would never translate into the desire to court her, to marry her, to make her their wife. She would remain untouched and untouchable, preserved for the god who had claimed her for his own. For Psyche, this enchantment manifested as a growing isolation that was all the more painful for being inexplicable. While her sisters married princes and departed for new lives filled with the normal joys and sorrows of mortal existence, Psyche remained in her father's palace, growing older but no less beautiful, increasingly aware that something was wrong, but unable to understand what or why. Suitors came to the palace, drawn by reports of her legendary beauty, but when they saw her, something would shift in their eyes. They would admire her from a respectful distance, would praise her appearance in courtly language, but none would step forward to ask for her hand. It was as though some invisible barrier stood between Psyche and the normal progression of a young woman's life toward marriage and family. The king and queen watched their youngest daughter's isolation with growing despair, their hearts heavy with a sorrow that gold and power could not remedy. They threw elaborate festivals and invited eligible young men from neighboring kingdoms, hoping that sheer numbers might overcome whatever strange curse seemed to keep their daughter unwed. But festival after festival ended the same way, with Psyche standing alone and increasingly sad while young men who should have been competing for her attention instead kept their respectful distance. In their desperation, they turned to the Oracle of Delphi, that sacred place where the gods spoke through mortal lips, where the future revealed itself in cryptic phrases wreathed in the smoke of burning laurel leaves. The journey to Delphi was long, requiring weeks of travel over mountain roads and coastal paths, and the wait for an audience with the oracle was longer still, for people came from all over the known world to seek divine guidance. When at last the king was granted his audience, he entered the sacred chamber deep within the temple of Apollo, where the Pythia sat upon her tripod above the chasm from which rose vapours that allowed her to see beyond the veil of time. The air was thick with those vapours, and with the smoke of burning laurel and the heavy scent of incense, and the king felt his head swim as he approached the oracle and asked his question about his daughter's fate. The oracle's response, when it came, was delivered in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere far away, a voice layered with harmonics that suggested something more than merely human speaking through the Pythia's mortal throat. The words she spoke sent ice through the veins of everyone who heard them, priests and attendants, and the king himself standing frozen in horror at the doom pronounced. Psyche, the oracle declared, was destined not for a mortal husband, but for a creature of terrible power, a being neither human nor entirely of this world, a winged serpent or dragon that even the gods themselves feared. She was to be dressed in funeral garments and left upon the summit of a lonely mountain peak, exposed to the elements and to her fate. There, the oracle said in tones of inexorable finality, would come her husband, and there would her marriage be consummated, though whether she would survive that consummation was left deliberately unclear. This was Psyche's destiny, and there could be no escape from it, no negotiation with the divine will that had pronounced this judgment. To refuse the oracle's command would be to invite the wrath of Apollo himself, to risk not just Psyche's life, but the safety and prosperity of the entire kingdom. The gods had spoken, and mortals had no choice but to obey. The king returned to his palace as though to a house of mourning, the oracle's words echoing in his mind like a death sentence. And in a sense it was a death sentence, or so they believed. They wept as they told their daughter what had been decreed, and Psyche, who had never asked for her beauty or the worship it inspired, who had in fact found that beauty to be more curse than blessing, accepted her fate with a quiet courage that made her attendants weep even harder. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that she had become a problem that required a divine solution. If the gods demanded her sacrifice, then she would not resist. There was a strange relief in it, actually, a sense that at least this terrible uncertainty about her future was being resolved, even if the resolution was death rather than marriage. And so preparations were made, but these were not the joyful preparations that should accompany a wedding that would have been made for her sisters' marriages. Instead, they carried all the somber weight of a funeral procession, a conflation of two rituals that should never have been combined. Psyche was bathed in water scented with oils of mourning rather than oils of celebration. Her hair was arranged in the style appropriate for a bride, but adorned not with flowers of joy, but with the dark cypress and myrtle branches associated with death and grief. The gown they dressed her in was white, as a bridal gown should be, but the whiteness was the white of a burial shroud, and the veil that covered her face was not the delicate silk of a happy bride, but the heavier fabric that mourners wore to shield their grief from public view. Jewelry was placed upon her, gold and precious stones that would have been a bride's gift from her family, but which now felt like grave goods being prepared for burial with the dead. Torches were lit, not the bright and cheerful torches that would light a wedding procession, but torches that burned with a sullen, smoky light, more appropriate for a funeral march. Musicians were summoned, but the songs they played were not wedding hymns, but laments, dirges that spoke of loss and grief, and the cutting short of a young life before its time. The procession that wound its way up the mountain path was silent, except for the sound of weeping and the mournful notes of flutes that traditionally accompanied funeral rites. The king walked as though each step cost him more than he could afford to pay, his face a mask of barely controlled grief. The queen could not walk at all, but had to be supported by her attendants, her body shaking with sobs that she could not suppress. Psyche's sisters, for all their jealousy of her beauty, wept genuine tears at seeing their youngest sibling being led away to what everyone believed would be her doom. And Psyche herself walked among them with her head held high, her face calm beneath the veil, even as tears streaked the faces around her. She had lived her life as an object of worship, untouched and separate, always aware that her beauty set her apart from normal human connection in ways that were both elevating and deeply isolating. Now she would meet her fate with the same isolated dignity that had defined her existence, accepting what came with a courage born not of confidence, but of resignation. The mountain path was steep and rocky, winding upward through scrub and scattered pines toward the barren summit where the oracle had decreed she must be left. As they climbed, the sounds of the lowlands fell away behind them, the distant bleating of goats and the calls of market vendors replaced by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the cry of eagles circling overhead. The air grew thinner and colder with each step upward, and by the time they reached the summit, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost mockingly beautiful given the grimness of their purpose. At the summit of the mountain, with the wind howling around them and the valleys spreading out below in darkening shadows, they left her. Her father tried to speak words of farewell but found his throat too tight with grief to manage more than a broken whisper of her name. Her mother could not speak at all, could only embrace her daughter one final time before being gently pulled away by her attendants. Psyche's sisters kissed her cheeks through their tears and whispered apologies for all the small cruelties of their shared childhood, as if those petty sins mattered in the face of this immense and terrible fate. The procession made its way back down the mountain in the gathering dusk, moving more quickly now despite the failing light, as if by hurrying they could somehow escape the horror of what they had just done, leaving a young woman alone on a desolate peak to face whatever would come for her in the dark. Several times members of the procession looked back, catching glimpses of Psyche's white-clad figure standing motionless against the darkening sky, and each time they looked she seemed smaller and more alone, a single point of light being slowly swallowed by the encroaching night. Psyche stood on the summit and watched them go, watched until the last torch had disappeared down the winding path and she could no longer hear even the faintest echo of their weeping. Then she was truly alone, standing on bare rock with the wind pulling at her garments and her veil, the stars beginning to emerge overhead in their ancient patterns, cold and distant and uncaring. She did not weep, though she felt as though she should. Instead, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her, a feeling almost of relief that the waiting was over, that whatever was going to happen would happen soon. She had no fear of death, having been raised in a culture that viewed it as a natural transition rather than an ending to be dreaded. If this was to be her time, if some monster was indeed coming to claim her as the oracle had foretold, then at least it would be an ending to the strange half-life she had been living, adored but not loved, worshipped but not known. But Psyche did not have to wait long alone on that windswept summit, and what came for her was not the monster everyone feared. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars grew bright and sharp overhead, she felt a change in the air around her, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced with each moment. The harsh mountain wind that had been whipping at her garments suddenly gentled, transformed into something else entirely, a breeze that felt almost conscious in its movement, almost purposeful, warm when it should have been cold, caressing when it should have been cutting. This was Zephyrus, the west wind, one of the 4 great wind gods who served at the pleasure of more powerful deities, and he had been sent with very specific instructions from Eros himself. Zephyrus, who had carried countless messages and passengers on behalf of the gods over the long ages of his existence, had never borne a burden more precious or more important than this mortal girl who stood shivering on the mountain peak. The wind wrapped itself around Psyche like invisible arms, gentle and careful, supporting her weight as if she weighed nothing at all. She felt her feet leave the rocky ground, felt herself being lifted into the air with a sensation that was strange but not frightening, dreamlike in its gentle surreality. There was no terror in this lifting, no violent snatching or rough handling, only a strange and almost comforting sense of being carried with infinite care through the darkness, held safe by something she could not see but could certainly feel. Psyche closed her eyes, surrendering to this impossible journey, trusting in this invisible bearer in a way she had never quite managed to trust in any mortal person. She felt the cool night air against her face, felt the wind moving through her hair and rustling her garments, felt the strange comfort of being held and carried like a child being brought home after falling asleep somewhere else. The journey seemed to last both an instant and an eternity, time stretching and compressing in that strange way it does when we are experiencing something entirely outside our normal frame of reference. When Zephyrus finally set her down again, lowering her with the same gentle care with which he had lifted her, Psyche kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, almost afraid to open them and see where this mysterious journey had brought her. When she did open her eyes, she found herself in a place that seemed to exist in a realm altogether separate from the world she had known, a place where the normal laws of mortal existence appeared to hold no sway. She stood in a meadow of such lush beauty that it almost hurt to look at it after the barren stone of the mountain peak. The grass beneath her feet was soft as the finest wool, thick and springy, starred with flowers that glowed faintly in the moonlight with their own inner radiance. The flowers were of types she had never seen before, some resembling roses but with petals that shimmered through colours no earthly rose had ever possessed, others like lilies but with a fragrance so sweet and strange that it seemed to carry hints of scents that had no earthly names, scents that spoke of divine gardens and celestial meadows beyond the reach of mortal cultivation. The fragrance that rose from the meadow was intoxicating without being overwhelming, a perfume so perfectly balanced that it seemed to ease tensions in her body and mind that she had not even known she carried. A stream wound through the meadow, its waters so clear and pure that they seemed to sing a gentle melody as they flowed over smooth stones that glinted with veins of precious metals, silver and gold catching the moonlight and throwing back reflections that danced and shifted with the movement of the water. The sound of the stream was soothing, a liquid music that seemed to carry meaning just beyond the threshold of understanding, like a language she had once known but had forgotten. Beyond the meadow, rising against the star-filled sky, stood a palace that made Psyche's breath catch in her throat, made her forget for a moment the fear and grief and confusion of the day that had just passed. It was not built of ordinary stone or brick, not shaped by the hands of human craftsmen labouring with mortar and sweat and the limitations of earthly materials. This palace seemed to have been called into being by divine will alone, shaped from materials that belonged to legends and to dreams, materials that should not have existed in the mortal world, but which somehow did, assembled here in this impossible place. The outer walls were constructed of blocks of gold so pure and bright that they glowed with their own inner radiance, illuminating the night around them with a warm and gentle light that required no torch or lamp to supplement it. The gold was not the dull yellow of earthly gold, but a richer, more vibrant shade, almost alive in its lustre, and it had been worked with such skill that the blocks fitted together with joints so fine that no mortar was needed to hold them, each block precisely shaped to nestle against its neighbours in perfect harmony. As Psyche approached, walking across the meadow as if in a trance, her bare feet sinking into the soft grass, and her veil forgotten and trailing behind her, she could see that the palace's architectural details were even more magnificent than the golden walls. The pillars that supported the porticos were fashioned from precious stones, not merely adorned with them, but carved entirely from single, massive gemstones. There were pillars of amethyst, the colour of twilight, of lapis lazuli deep as the ocean depths, of rose quartz that seemed to capture and hold the last light of sunset. Each one had been carved with such exquisite skill that scenes seemed to move within the stone itself, images of gardens and forests and celestial landscapes that shifted and changed depending on the angle from which they were viewed. The doorposts were of silver that had been worked into forms of surpassing delicacy, vines and flowers and birds so lifelike that Psyche half expected them to rustle and sing as she passed. The silver had a sheen that earthly silver could never match, a brightness that did not tarnish or dim, and it had been polished to such perfection that it reflected the world around it in images clearer than any mortal mirror could produce. The great doors stood open, welcoming her inside, and as Psyche crossed the threshold, she felt a subtle shift in the air, as though she were passing through some invisible boundary that separated the merely marvellous from the truly divine. The interior of the palace exceeded even the magnificence of its exterior, if such a thing were possible. The floors were mosaics of gemstones, not roughly set as even the finest earthly craftsman might create, but polished and fitted with such precision that walking across them was like walking across a surface of frozen light, each step releasing tiny sparkles and gleams from the perfectly cut stones beneath her feet. The patterns in the floor mosaics were scenes from myths and legends, some familiar to Psyche from the stories she had heard all her life, others utterly unknown, depicting gods and heroes and events from times and places beyond mortal knowledge. As she walked, she noticed that the scenes seemed to move and shift, that figures she had passed moments before would be in different positions when she looked back at them, as though the mosaics were not static art, but windows into living worlds. The ceilings soared overhead at heights that should have been impossible for any structure to support, carved from ivory and citron wood in patterns of such complexity and beauty that Psyche could spend hours studying any single panel and still not comprehend all its details. The carvings depicted scenes both earthly and divine, forests where real trees intertwined with imaginary ones, oceans where real fish swam alongside creatures from the depths of myth, skies where real stars shared space with celestial beings of pure light. The walls were covered with reliefs in silver and gold, images that seemed to be frozen in the moment just before they came fully to life, horses that looked ready to gallop from their metallic frames, birds whose wings seemed poised to beat the air, human figures caught in gestures so natural and fluid that Psyche found herself expecting them to complete their movements and step down from the walls to walk among the living. Psyche moved through the palace in a daze of wonder, her footsteps echoing softly in the vast and luminous chambers, each sound carrying a quality of clarity and purity that ordinary echoes did not possess. Every room revealed new marvels, new impossibilities made manifest. Here was a bathing chamber where the pools were lined with mother of pearl that shimmered with colors that shifted between pink and blue and green and silver, and where the water that flowed from golden spouts in the shape of dolphins and swans was always the perfect temperature without any human adjustment, scented with oils whose fragrances changed subtly to match the bather's mood and needs. There was a library whose shelves stretched from floor to impossibly high ceiling, containing scrolls and codices written in languages both familiar and utterly unknown, their pages illustrated with images that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles or in different lights, images that told stories no mortal had ever heard, that contained knowledge no human sage had ever acquired. The very air in the library smelled of old parchment and rare inks and the peculiar scent of knowledge preserved through ages beyond counting. There was a music room where instruments of every kind hung upon the walls or stood arranged in careful positions, lyres and pipes and drums and stringed instruments of types Psyche could not name, each one perfectly tuned and waiting to be played, each one seeming to hum with potential music even in silence. When she moved through the room, she could have sworn she heard the faintest whispers of melody, as though the instruments themselves were breathing quiet songs into the air. There was a garden courtyard open to the sky, where trees grew that bore fruit of pure gold and silver, their branches heavy with metallic produce that should have been impossible, but which hung there gleaming in the moonlight, as if the most natural thing in the world. Birds with jeweled plumage roosted in these trees, their feathers sparkling with what appeared to be actual precious stones, emeralds and rubies and sapphires embedded in their wings and tails, and they sang melodies that made Psyche's heart ache with emotions she could not name, songs of loss and longing and joy, all intertwined in harmonies that human music could never quite achieve. And yet, for all its magnificence, the palace was utterly empty of people. Psyche saw no servants, no guards, no other living soul moving through these glorious halls. The silence should have been oppressive, perhaps even frightening, the loneliness overwhelming, but instead it felt peaceful, expectant, as if the palace itself were holding its breath in anticipation of something yet to come, some event for which all this magnificence had been prepared. Then she heard the voices. They came from everywhere and nowhere, gentle and disembodied, speaking to her with warmth and reassurance that held no trace of threat or deception. The voices were melodious and kind, pitched perfectly to soothe rather than startle, and they addressed her with a respect and affection that she had rarely experienced in her worship-focused life in the mortal world. "Welcome, mistress," they said, harmonizing in ways that human voices should not have been able to harmonize, creating chords and overtones that made the words themselves seem to shimmer in the air. All that you see here is yours. This palace, these treasures, these comforts all exist to serve you, to give you joy and peace. You need only wish for something, and it shall be yours. You need fear nothing here, for nothing in this place will ever bring you harm. Rest now, for you must be weary from your long and strange journey. Let us attend to your needs. Psyche found herself guided by these invisible presences, felt gentle touches on her arms and shoulders directing her, though she could see no one who might be doing the touching. The sensations were respectful, never invasive, always waiting for her implied permission before continuing. She was led through the vast palace to a chamber that had clearly been prepared specifically for her, decorated in colours she loved without having mentioned them, furnished with items that suited her taste without her having expressed that taste. The bed that dominated the chamber was the most comfortable thing she had ever seen, let alone experienced. It was large enough for several people but felt somehow intimate rather than overwhelming, its frame carved from a wood she did not recognize, smooth and warm to the touch, inlaid with patterns in silver and mother of pearl. The linens were softer than clouds, woven from threads so fine they seemed barely substantial, yet they felt warm and substantial when she touched them. The pillows seemed to cradle her head with conscious care, adjusting themselves to provide exactly the right support for her neck and shoulders. Psyche lay down, still dressed in her funeral garments that had somehow become less grim in this beautiful place, and sleep came over her like a gentle tide, pulling her down into dreams of impossible colors and beautiful music, dreams where she flew over landscapes of stunning beauty, where she spoke with beings of light, where she finally felt at peace with her own existence in a way she never had in her mortal life. When she woke, she found that her funeral robes had been replaced during her sleep with garments of such beauty and richness that she could barely comprehend their value or their craftsmanship. The gown that now clothed her was woven from threads of silk finer than spiderweb, so delicate that it seemed made of light itself rather than any material substance. It was embroidered with patterns in silver and gold thread that seemed to shift and change in the light, depicting scenes that told stories she could almost but not quite understand, narratives woven into fabric that whispered of love and loss and redemption. Jewels adorned her fingers and throat, not the gaudy displays of mortal royalty showing off their wealth, but subtle and perfect stones that seemed chosen specifically to complement her own natural beauty rather than to overwhelm it. There was a necklace of pearls that glowed with inner light, each one perfectly round and exactly the right size, strung on a chain so fine it was almost invisible. There were rings that fitted her fingers as though made specifically for her hands, set with stones that caught the light in ways that made her breath catch. The invisible voices invited her to bathe, and Psyche found herself guided back to the bathing chamber she had glimpsed the night before, now prepared for her use. The pools had been filled with water that steamed gently, giving off fragrances of flowers and herbs that seemed to ease every ache in her body even before she entered the water. Unseen hands helped her from her garments, the touches gentle and respectful, clearly performed by beings who viewed this as sacred service rather than mere duty. The water embraced her like a warm caress when she stepped into the pool, its temperature absolutely perfect, adjusted somehow to exactly what her body needed in that moment. As she bathed, unseen attendants washed her hair with unguents that smelled of flowers that bloomed only in divine gardens, worked the soap through her long tresses with care and expertise, rinsed away the dust and grief of the previous day until she felt renewed and cleansed in a way that went beyond mere physical cleaning. She was dried with linens that felt like warm air against her skin, soft beyond anything earthly manufacture could achieve. Her hair was arranged in a style both simple and elegant, neither the elaborate constructions favored by wealthy mortals nor the severe simplicity of mourning, but something perfectly balanced between beauty and comfort. Fresh garments were brought for her, simpler than the ones she had woken in but no less beautiful, easy to move in but still lovely to look upon. Then she was led to a dining hall where a table had been laid with such a feast as she had never imagined in her most extravagant dreams. There were fruits that gleamed like gems, some familiar to her eyes but tasting far better than any earthly version, others utterly unknown and strange, their flavors bursting on her tongue like concentrated sunshine and moonlight, and all the good things of the world distilled into edible form. There were delicacies, both savory and sweet, dishes that seemed to have been prepared by cooks who understood taste in ways that mortal chefs could never achieve, combinations of flavors that should not have worked together but which harmonized perfectly on her palate. The bread was light as air but substantial enough to satisfy, the cheeses were complex and delicious, the meats were tender and flavorful without being heavy. Wine flowed into her cup seemingly of its own accord, ruby red and clear as crystal, and it was the nectar of the gods themselves, warming her blood and filling her with a gentle contentment that was almost like joy, but more subtle, more sustained. She felt no dizziness from the wine, no fog in her mind, only a pleasant warmth and a sense of well-being that suffused her entire body. As she ate, music filled the air around her, though she could see no musicians and no instruments producing the sounds. She heard the clear notes of a lyre being played with consummate skill, each plucked string releasing a sound so pure and perfect that it seemed to resonate in her very bones. Voices rose in harmonies that made her think of starlight and summer rain and all beautiful things that exist beyond the power of language to capture, singing in a language she did not understand but which moved her heart nonetheless. The music wrapped around her like an embrace, filling the dining hall with beauty that was almost tangible, and for the first time since people had begun worshipping her as a goddess, since her beauty had set her apart and made her an object rather than a person, Psyche felt truly at peace. Here, in this impossible place, attended by invisible servants and surrounded by beauty beyond mortal comprehension, she could simply be herself, could exist without the weight of others' expectations and worship pressing down upon her. Days passed in this strange and beautiful existence, falling into a rhythm that felt both new and somehow ancient, as though she had always been meant to live this way and had only now found her proper place. The invisible servants attended to her every need before she even fully articulated what those needs were, providing food and entertainment and comfort with a devotion and skill that far exceeded anything mortal servants could offer. Psyche explored the vast palace, discovering new wonders in every chamber and corridor, finding that each day revealed rooms and spaces she had somehow missed on previous explorations. There were rooms filled with instruments that played themselves at her approach, each one selecting pieces that perfectly matched her mood in that moment. There were rooms lined with mirrors of polished silver that showed not just her reflection, but scenes from distant places and times, windows into other lives and other worlds that she could watch for hours without ever growing bored. There were rooms where the very air seemed alive with possibilities she could barely comprehend, where she felt that if she just thought the right thoughts or spoke the right words, she could make anything happen, could reshape reality itself to her will. But she never quite dared to test that theory, never quite pushed against the boundaries of what seemed possible in this place, content instead to accept the wonders that were offered to her without demanding more. She walked in the gardens for hours each day, studying the impossible plants and watching the jeweled birds, sitting by fountains that played with water that sang as it fell, breathing air that tasted of flowers and sunshine and all good things. She read in the library, choosing scrolls at random and discovering stories and knowledge that amazed and delighted her. She bathed in the fragrant pools whenever she felt the need for renewal, letting the scented waters wash away the memories of her old life and prepare her for whatever this new existence would bring. But as the days turned to weeks, Psyche began to feel a new kind of loneliness settling over her, different from the isolation she had felt in her father's palace, but no less profound. The palace was beautiful beyond measure. The luxuries were unimaginable, the comforts were without limit, but she was still utterly alone in a way that all the invisible servants in the world could not remedy. She had no one to talk to about the things she saw and felt, No companion with whom to share the wonders around her, no friend to help her make sense of this strange new existence. The invisible servants were kind and attentive, but they were not companions. They fulfilled her needs but did not engage with her thoughts or feelings. They served her perfectly but did not know her, could not offer the kind of emotional connection that humans need to truly thrive. Psyche found herself talking aloud just to hear a human voice, her own words echoing in the vast chambers, a reminder of her fundamental solitude in this paradise. She began to wonder about the purpose of all this beauty and luxury, about why she had been brought here and what was expected of her. Was she to live out her life in solitary comfort, growing old in this timeless place, while the mortal world continued without her? Was she being preserved for some purpose yet to be revealed? Or was this luxury simply an elaborate cage, beautiful but still a prison, keeping her isolated from everything and everyone she had ever known? Then one night, as she lay in her magnificent bed unable to sleep despite the perfect comfort of the linens and the gentle music that played softly in the background, she heard a sound that was different from anything she had heard before in the palace. It was the soft whisper of breathing, the gentle rustle of movement, and she realized with a start that she was no longer alone in the chamber. Someone, or something, had entered her room under cover of darkness, had crossed the threshold while she lay there in the dark, vulnerable and exposed. Psyche's heart hammered in her chest, fear flooding through her body in a cold rush that made her breathing quicken and her muscles tense. Every terrible story she had ever heard about monsters and demons came rushing back into her mind. The oracle's words echoed in her thoughts. A creature that even the gods feared, a winged serpent that would be her husband. Had that monster finally come to claim her? Had all this beauty and comfort been merely preparation for some terrible consummation? But before fear could overwhelm her entirely, before she could cry out or try to flee, a voice spoke from the darkness near her bed, and it was the most beautiful voice she had ever heard in her life. It was warm and rich and filled with a tenderness that made something inside her chest constrict with an emotion she could not name. It was a masculine voice, deep but not threatening, powerful but gentle, carrying tones that spoke of immortal youth and divine grace. "Do not be afraid, Psyche," the voice said, each word carefully chosen and perfectly delivered, meant to soothe rather than frighten. "I am your husband, the one for whom this palace was prepared, the one who has been waiting for you to come to your proper home. I have come to you as was always meant to be, as was destined from the moment I first saw you sleeping in your chamber in your father's palace. This palace is ours, and you are safe here, safer than you have ever been in your life. No harm will come to you while you are under my protection." The voice continued to speak to her in the darkness, words of reassurance and affection, telling her things about herself that no one else had ever noticed or cared about, seeing past her legendary beauty to the person underneath, the girl who had felt isolated and alone, even in the midst of crowds of worshippers. The voice spoke of having watched her for weeks before bringing her here, of having seen her kindness to servants and her gentleness with animals, her quiet sadness when she thought no one was looking, her courage in accepting what she thought was a sentence of death. Psyche found her fear melting away as the voice spoke, replaced by a strange and growing trust that had no logical basis but which felt right nonetheless. She could not see the speaker, could only sense his presence near her in the darkness, but something in his voice convinced her that he meant her no harm, that whatever else he might be, he was not the monster she had been taught to fear. When he asked permission to join her on the bed, speaking the request with a courtesy and respect that no monster would have shown, she granted it, her voice soft in the darkness but steady. When he reached for her in the blackness of the chamber, she did not pull away, but instead moved toward him, seeking the comfort of physical presence after so many weeks of isolation and invisibility. What happened then was both strange and wonderful. A physical intimacy conducted entirely in darkness, with a partner whose face she could not see and whose form she could only sense through touch and sound and scent. Her husband was warm where she expected cold, gentle where she feared violence, patient where she might have anticipated urgency. His hands on her body were reverent, his caresses filled with a wonder and tenderness that made her feel truly seen for the first time in her life, not as an object of worship, but as a beloved partner, someone precious and valued not for her appearance, but for herself. When he made her his wife in truth, the experience was one of profound connection, of two souls meeting and recognizing each other across the barriers of flesh and darkness, and the vast gulf that separated mortal from immortal, though Psyche did not yet know how vast that gulf truly was. There was some pain, as there often is in first unions, but it was brief and overshadowed by the overwhelming sense of rightness, of finding a place and a person where she belonged at last. Afterward, as they lay together in the bed, her husband spoke to her again, his voice now carrying a note of seriousness that made her pay careful attention even in her state of sated contentment. "Psyche," he said, and she could hear the weight of what he was about to say in the way he spoke her name. "This can be a life of great happiness for both of us, happiness beyond anything you have known or imagined. But there is one condition, one rule that you must absolutely observe if we are to have the future I long to share with you." He paused, and in that pause Psyche heard years of sadness and loneliness that matched her own, heard the vulnerability of someone who had never before risked his heart and who was terrified of having that risk end in betrayal. When he spoke again, his voice was firm but also pleading, commanding but also begging. "You must never attempt to see my face," he said. "You must never bring light into this chamber when I am here with you. I come to you only in darkness, and in darkness I must remain. I cannot tell you why this is necessary, cannot explain the reasons for this demand, but I swear to you that they are real and important, and that they exist for your protection as much as my own. If you violate this trust, if you attempt to look upon me, everything we have together will be destroyed, not just damaged or temporarily disrupted, but completely and irrevocably destroyed. Do you understand? Can you promise me this?" Psyche, still floating in the warmth and contentment of their love-making, still overwhelmed by the kindness and tenderness this invisible husband had shown her, readily agreed. What did it matter if she could not see her husband's face, she reasoned, when his voice was so beautiful and his touch so tender? What did physical appearance matter when the connection between them felt so profound and so right? She had been worshipped for her appearance her entire life, and had found that worship hollow and isolating. Perhaps this marriage in darkness was the antidote to all those years of being valued only for what could be seen. She promised, her voice earnest in the darkness, placing her hand over her heart in a gesture he could not see but which felt right nonetheless, that she would never seek to look upon him, that she would be content to know him through all her other senses, that she would trust him absolutely. And her husband, believing her or perhaps simply wanting desperately to believe her, accepted that promise and held her close as they both drifted toward sleep. And so a pattern was established that would govern their life together for the weeks and months that followed, a rhythm of separation and reunion that came to define Psyche's existence in the palace. During the day, when the sun rose and light filled the rooms and corridors, Psyche had the palace entirely to herself. Her husband would leave before dawn, departing so silently that she never heard him go, never knew the moment when solitude replaced companionship. She filled her daylight hours with exploration and leisure and all the small pleasures that the invisible servants provided and that the palace itself offered. She walked in the gardens, watching how the flowers opened to the sun and released new fragrances in the warmth of day that were different from their night scents. She read in the library, making her way through scrolls and codices that told her about the history of the world, about the nature of the gods, about philosophy and poetry, and all the accumulated wisdom of ages. She bathed in the fragrant pools, letting the water work away any lingering tension or worry. She ate delicious meals, tasting new foods and flavors that delighted her palate and nourished her body. But As soon as darkness fell each evening, as soon as the sun sank below the horizon and the stars emerged in their ancient patterns overhead, her husband would come to her. Psyche would retire to her chamber as the last light faded from the sky, would lie in her bed in the darkness and wait, and always he would arrive, his presence filling the room before he spoke, before he touched her, before he joined her in the bed and made love to her with a passion and tenderness that grew deeper with each passing night. And after the lovemaking, they would talk for hours in the darkness, sharing thoughts and dreams and stories in voices soft enough that they seemed to blend with the silence around them. Psyche told him about her childhood, about the strange experience of being worshipped for her beauty, about her loneliness and her fears and her hopes. And he told her, in carefully chosen words that revealed much while still maintaining necessary secrets, about his own life, about the loneliness that came from being always seen as one thing, always valued for one particular quality, always expected to fulfill certain roles without being allowed the complexity of full personhood. Through these conversations, Psyche felt that she was coming to know this invisible husband more intimately than she had ever known anyone in her life, despite the fact that she had never seen his face, had no idea what color his eyes were, or whether his hair was dark or light, or what expressions crossed his features when he spoke of things that moved him. She knew him by the quality of his silences, by the way his breathing changed when he was amused or moved, by the feel of his body beside hers and the sound of his voice and the tenderness of his touch. She was happy, or at least she thought she was. The loneliness that had plagued her in those first days and weeks in the palace had been replaced by the warmth of companionship and what she was beginning to recognize as love. She had everything she could possibly need or want, a magnificent home, unlimited luxury, invisible servants who anticipated her every desire, and a husband who adored her and whom she was growing to adore in return. What more could any woman ask for? But there was still something missing, a small hollow place in her heart that she tried to ignore but which would not be entirely silenced. Despite the fullness of her life in the palace, despite the depth of her connection with her husband, she found herself thinking more and more often of the life she had left behind. She missed her family, despite the complicated nature of her relationship with them. She missed her sisters, despite their jealousy of her beauty, and despite all the small cruelties that sisters can inflict upon each other in the complicated dynamics of family life. She wondered how they were, what their lives were like now in the kingdoms they had married into, whether they thought of her sometimes, or whether they had moved on entirely from the sister they believed had been sacrificed to a monster. She wondered about her parents, whether they still grieved for her, or whether time had eased their sorrow, whether they had perhaps even had other children to help fill the void her absence had left. They were her connections to the world she had come from, to the life of mortals, and sunlight, and human companionship that did not depend on invisible voices and disembodied presences. And while her new life was in many ways far better than her old one, while she was happier and more fulfilled than she had ever been in her father's palace, there was still a part of her that longed for those connections, that needed to know that she had not been entirely forgotten by the people who had raised her and loved her in their imperfect human way. One night, as she lay in her husband's arms in the darkness after making love, Psyche found the courage to speak of this longing. Her voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, aware that she was asking for something that might not be wise or even possible, but the need to voice this desire had grown too strong to continue suppressing. "My love," she said, her words soft in the darkness, barely louder than a whisper, "I want you to know that I am happy here with you, happier than I ever thought I could be. You have given me more than I ever dared to hope for, and I am grateful beyond words for this life we share. But there is something I find myself longing for, a desire that grows stronger with each passing day rather than fading as I hoped it might." She paused, gathering her courage, feeling her husband's body tense slightly beside her as he waited for her to continue, perhaps already suspecting what she was going to say. "I find myself thinking of my family," she said at last. "I wonder how they fare, whether they still mourn for me or if they have found peace in their lives." My sisters especially. I wonder if they think of me sometimes, if they remember their youngest sister who was taken away to become what they believed would be a monster's bride, devoured on a mountain peak or in some dark cave. She felt tears gathering in her eyes, though he could not see them in the darkness. "Would it be possible for me to see them again?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly with the force of her longing. "Just once, just to let them know that I am alive and well, that the fate they feared for me did not come to pass. I know it is much to ask, but it would bring me such comfort to reconnect with the people who were my world before I came here to you." In the darkness, she felt her husband stiffen beside her, felt tension radiating from his invisible form like heat from a forge. When he spoke, his voice was troubled, carrying notes of worry and foreboding that made her heart sink even before she heard his words. "Psyche," he said slowly, carefully, as though choosing each word with great deliberation, "I understand your longing, truly I do. The connection to one's family is a powerful thing, not to be dismissed or devalued. But I must warn you, as strongly as I know how to warn you, that this is a dangerous wish, one that could bring consequences far worse than the temporary loneliness you feel now." He sat up in the bed, and though she could not see him, she could sense the intensity of his focus, could feel his gaze upon her even in the complete darkness of the chamber. "Your sisters," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her shiver, "are not what they seem, or perhaps more accurately, they are exactly what they seem, and that is the problem. There is jealousy in their hearts, Psyche, envy of you that has been festering since childhood, growing stronger with each year that passed and finding new fuel every time they saw your beauty outshine their own." He reached for her in the darkness, found her hands and held them, his grip gentle but firm. "If they see the life you now lead, if they witness the luxury and beauty that surround you, if they understand that your marriage has brought you not death but happiness beyond anything they could have imagined, that jealousy will not transform into joy for you. Instead, it will curdle into something uglier and more dangerous. They will not be happy for you, my love. They will seek to undermine your happiness, to plant seeds of doubt in your mind about me and about this life we share." He pulled her closer, and she could hear the desperation in his voice now, the urgent need for her to understand and to listen. "I beg you to reconsider this request," he said. "Trust in the life we have built together, in the love that grows between us with each passing day. Do not invite these toxic influences into our sanctuary, for I fear they will bring nothing but harm." But Psyche, for all her love for this husband she had never seen, found that she could not let go of her desire to see her family again. The longing was too strong, had become too central to the small dissatisfaction she felt in her otherwise perfect life. She began to weep in the darkness, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded with him, her voice breaking with the force of her emotion. "I understand your concerns," she said through her tears, "and I know you have reason to fear for my happiness, to want to protect me from anything that might threaten what we have together. But please, I cannot simply cut myself off from everyone I knew before, cannot pretend that my entire life began the day I came here. I need this connection, need to know that I am not entirely separated from the world I came from. If I cannot have this, I fear I will die of sorrow, will wither away from this loneliness that eats at me despite all the love and luxury you provide." She wept harder, her body shaking with sobs, and felt his resistance beginning to crumble in the face of her genuine distress. She did not do this consciously, did not deliberately manipulate his feelings, but the effect was the same. Her husband, who loved her perhaps too much, who had already defied divine law and filial duty to be with her, could deny her nothing when she wept, could not bear to be the cause of her unhappiness. There was a long silence in the darkness, broken only by Psyche's slowly subsiding sobs, and she knew he was wrestling with himself, torn between his love for her and his very real concerns about the wisdom of what she asked. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to carry all the weight of the world, he relented. "Very well," he said, his voice heavy with resignation and perhaps with premonition of disaster to come. "I will allow Zephyrus to bring your sisters here to visit you. You may see them, may show them your new home, may reassure them that you are alive and well. But Psyche, I warn you again, and I beg you with everything in me to heed this warning. Pay close attention to it in a way you have perhaps not paid attention to my previous cautions." He held her face between his hands, though she could not see him doing so, could only feel the warmth of his palms against her cheeks, the intensity of his focus even in the darkness. "They will try to convince you to look upon my face," he said, each word carefully articulated, weighted with importance. "They will tell you that I must be hiding some monstrous deformity, that no true husband would demand to remain unseen, that any loving relationship must be based on complete knowledge including physical appearance. They will play upon your curiosity and your fears, will use every manipulation they can think of to undermine your trust in me." His hands tightened slightly on her face, not painfully but with enough pressure to ensure she was paying attention. "You must not listen to them, Psyche. You must not give in to their poisonous suggestions. If you look upon me, if you violate the one promise I have asked you to keep, everything will be lost. Not just damaged, not just made more difficult, but completely and utterly destroyed. Our marriage will end. This palace will vanish, and you will find yourself back in the mortal world with nothing but memories of what might have been." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was softer, almost pleading. "Do you understand what I am saying to you? Do you truly, fully understand the stakes of this decision you are making?" Psyche promised once again, with all the sincerity she could muster, that she would not be swayed by her sister's words, that she understood the danger and would guard against it. She told him, believing it to be true as she said it, that nothing her sisters could say would overcome the deep trust and love she felt for this husband who had given her everything, who loved her so completely and tenderly. She was confident in her own strength of will, in her ability to resist manipulation, in the power of the connection they had forged together in the darkness of their marriage bed. But confidence, as Psyche would soon discover to her sorrow, is often just another word for the ignorance that precedes a fall, and strength of will is a far more fragile thing than we like to believe when we have not yet been truly tested. When Zephyrus brought Psyche's sisters to the palace several days later, wafting them down from the mountainside on gentle breezes and depositing them in the flower-starred meadow before the golden walls, the reunion was at first filled with all the joy and relief that Psyche had hoped for and expected. Her sisters embraced her with what seemed like genuine affection, weeping with happiness to find her alive and whole, exclaiming over her beauty which, if anything, had grown even more radiant in her time in this magical place, fed by love and happiness in a way that mere mortal existence had never managed to feed it. They held her hands and kissed her cheeks and told her, voices breaking with apparent emotion, how they had mourned for her, how they had been certain she was dead, devoured by the monster the oracle had promised, how they had wept and prayed and made offerings at temples in hopes that her death had at least been quick and painless. To hear that she was alive, that she was, well, that she was here in this impossible place, seemed at first to fill them with nothing but joy and relief. But as Psyche, glowing with happiness at this reunion, led her sisters into the palace and began to show them the wonders it contained, she began to see her husband's warning manifest in their changing expressions, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced with each new marvel revealed. The joy in their faces began to shift, transforming into something harder and colder, something that looked almost like pain but which was actually envy of the most toxic kind. They looked at the golden walls and jeweled pillars with eyes that narrowed rather than widened, calculating the value of what they saw, comparing it unfavorably to their own palaces which, though grand by mortal standards, were mere hovels compared to this divine dwelling. They tasted the magnificent feast that the invisible servants laid before them, and instead of delight at the incredible flavors and perfect preparation, their faces showed resentment, as though each delicious bite was a personal insult to them and the more ordinary meals they consumed in their own homes. They touched the silken hangings and the jewelled mosaics with hands that trembled, not with wonder, but with a desperate, grasping desire to possess what their sister had, to take it for themselves, or, failing that, to see her lose it so that she would be brought down to their level or below. The transformation was gradual enough that Psyche, eager to share her happiness and genuinely believing her sisters would rejoice in her good fortune, did not notice it at first. But it was there, obvious to anyone with eyes to see and emotional intelligence enough to recognize the signs of jealousy transforming into active malice. You see, Psyche's sisters had married well by mortal standards. They were princesses, wed to princes, living in palaces of marble and limestone, commanding servants and enjoying the luxuries that wealth and status could provide. In their own kingdoms they were important people, respected and even envied by those of lower station. Their husbands, while neither young nor particularly exciting, were nonetheless wealthy and powerful, men of influence who provided comfortable lives and demanded little beyond the usual wifely duties. But comfort and adequacy are cold comforts indeed when compared to magnificence and perfection, and that is what Psyche now possessed. Where their palaces were built of stone, hers was built of gold and precious gems. Where their servants were visible and sometimes sullen mortals who needed to be managed and occasionally disciplined, hers were invisible presences who anticipated her every need with perfect devotion. Where their food was merely good, prepared by skilled cooks working with fine ingredients, hers was divine, created by processes beyond mortal understanding to achieve flavors that transcended anything earthly cuisine could produce. And where their husbands were aging mortal men, growing older and less attractive with each passing year, dealing with the aches and pains and diminishing vigor that comes with mortal existence, Psyche's husband, though unseen, was clearly something far more than mortal, a being of power and wealth beyond human measure, capable of creating and maintaining this impossible palace and all its wonders. The jealousy that took root in the sisters' hearts that day was not the petty envy of childhood rivals squabbling over toys or parental attention. It was something deeper and more poisonous, a resentment so profound that it twisted their love for their sister into something ugly and destructive. They wanted what she had, wanted it with a desperation that was almost like physical pain. And if they could not have it for themselves, if this divine luxury and impossible love was forever beyond their reach, then they wanted to see Psyche lose it, wanted to bring her crashing down from these heights to suffer in the mortal world as they themselves suffered. When they asked about her husband, Psyche, mindful of her promise to her husband, but perhaps not understanding the depths of her sister's malice, tried to deflect their questions. She spoke in vague terms, describing him one moment as a young man who spent his days hunting in the mountains, then in another moment as a merchant who travelled frequently on business, her stories contradictory and obviously evasive to anyone who was paying attention. And her sisters did pay close attention, noting every hesitation, every inconsistency, every sign that Psyche was hiding something or perhaps knew far less about her husband than a wife should know. They exchanged glances when she contradicted herself, small smiles that did not reach their eyes, and Psyche, in her happiness and her eagerness to share her joy, missed these signs of their growing conviction that there was something very wrong with their sister's situation, something they could exploit to their advantage. Before they left, carried away again by Zephyrus, with their arms laden with gifts of gold and jewels that Psyche had pressed upon them in her generosity, the sisters had already begun to formulate their plan. They had seen their sister's happiness, had witnessed the luxury and beauty she now enjoyed, and they could not bear it. They had to find a way to destroy it, to punish Psyche for possessing what they could never have, to restore some balance to a world that had given her so much more than it had given them. The fact that Psyche had done nothing to earn her good fortune beyond possessing extraordinary beauty, that she had in fact been a victim of circumstances beyond her control before finding happiness in this palace, did not matter to her sisters. The fact that they themselves had comfortable lives, loving children in some cases, positions of respect and influence in their adopted kingdoms, these things did not matter either. All that mattered was that Psyche had more, and that imbalance needed to be corrected, or more accurately, overcorrected in the other direction. Over the following weeks, as they returned to their own kingdoms and their own lives, the sisters nursed their jealousy like a precious treasure, feeding it with fantasies of revenge and scenarios of Psyche's downfall. They corresponded with each other through messengers, sharing their poison and reinforcing each other's worst impulses, until finally they felt ready to return to the palace and put their plan into action. On their second visit, which Psyche had foolishly begged her husband to allow, despite his increasing reluctance and despite his more and more urgent warnings, the sisters came armed with lies and manipulation so carefully crafted that they might have impressed military strategists or politicians schooled in the arts of rhetoric and persuasion. They took Psyche aside, away from the feast and luxury of the public spaces, into a quiet corner of the garden where they could speak to her privately. Their faces were masks of concern that barely concealed the malice underneath, their voices pitched to convey worry and sisterly affection, even as they began their campaign of psychological warfare with a skill born of intimate knowledge of their sister's vulnerabilities and insecurities. "Dear sister," they began, their voices dripping with false sympathy, taking her hands in theirs and looking into her eyes with expressions of troubled compassion. "We have been so worried about you since our last visit. We could not sleep for thinking about your situation, for the strangeness of it all, for the red flags that we saw but which you seem unable or unwilling to acknowledge." They moved closer, lowering their voices to conspiratorial whispers, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and shared secrets. "Have you not noticed how strange your situation is?" they asked, their eyes wide with feigned concern. "What manner of husband refuses to show his face to his wife? What man, unless he has something terrible to hide, demands that his bride remain forever in ignorance of his true appearance? It is not natural, Psyche, it is not right, and it frightens us to think of what it might mean." They reminded her of the oracle's words, drawing on the terror of that original prophecy to give weight to their lies. "The oracle said you were destined for a monstrous creature," they whispered, their voices trembling as though with genuine fear, "a being feared by gods and mortals alike, a winged serpent or dragon of terrible aspect. Do you truly believe, dear sister, that the oracle was wrong? That after all these centuries of unerring prophecy, Delphi suddenly made a mistake when speaking of your fate?" They paused, letting that question hang in the air, watching Psyche's face for signs that their words were finding purchase, that doubt was beginning to take root in her mind. "Or is it not far more likely," they continued, their voices soft but insistent, "that the oracle spoke true, that you are indeed married to a monster, a creature so hideous and terrible that he cannot bear to let you see him for fear you will flee in horror the moment you lay eyes upon his true form?" They painted pictures for her of the monster they claimed her husband must be, drawing on mythology and folklore to create an image designed to terrify. They described a serpent with scales that scraped together as it moved, with fangs dripping venom and eyes that glowed with unholy light. They spoke of a dragon with breath of fire and poison, with claws that could rend flesh from bone, and a hunger for mortal meat that could never be truly satisfied. "Perhaps," they whispered, leaning even closer, their breath hot against her ear, "he is only waiting for you to bear his child. Perhaps he plans to keep you alive until you give birth, fattening you up like livestock before the slaughter, and then he will devour both you and the baby when the time is right. After all, what else do monsters do with the beautiful maidens they capture? Why else would he insist on darkness, on hiding his true nature from you, unless he knows that you would flee if you saw what he really was?" Psyche tried to resist their words, tried to hold fast to her trust in the husband who had been nothing but kind and loving to her, who had shown her tenderness and passion and what she believed to be genuine care. But her sisters were skilled manipulators, and they knew exactly how to find the small seed of doubt that exists in every human heart and water it until it grows into a choking vine of suspicion. They appealed to her intelligence, suggesting that only a fool would continue in blind obedience when all the evidence pointed to danger. They appealed to her pride, implying that she was being weak and submissive in accepting her husband's demand for secrecy. They appealed to her fear, describing in lurid detail what they claimed awaited her if she did not take action to protect herself. "If you truly believe your husband is as he seems," they challenged her, their voices taking on an edge of contempt, "if you had such faith in his goodness and his love, then what harm could there be in simply looking at him? What loving husband would demand such absolute obedience, such complete submission to a rule that makes no sense? Why would any decent man insist on hiding his appearance from his wife unless he had something monstrous to conceal?" They left her with a plan, simple and terrible in its elegance. They told her to hide a lamp, well filled with oil and fitted with a fresh wick, somewhere in her bedchamber where she could easily reach it. They told her to take a sharp knife as well, the kind used for slaughtering animals, and to hide it beside the lamp. When her husband fell asleep that night, they instructed she should carefully light the lamp and look upon his true form. If he was indeed a monster, as they claimed, she could use the knife to slay him before he woke and devoured her. If he was not, if he was truly the loving husband he claimed to be, then surely he would forgive her small transgression, her understandable need to know the truth. After all, what kind of love demanded blind obedience without trust or understanding? As Psyche watched her sisters depart once more, carried away by Zephyrus on his gentle winds, their false concern and real malice hidden behind smiles and embraces, she felt as though a poison had been poured into her mind, spreading through her thoughts like ink through clear water, staining everything it touched. She tried to convince herself that her sisters were wrong, that her husband deserved her trust, that she should simply forget their words and continue in the happy ignorance that had served her so well thus far. But doubt, once planted, is an insidious thing, as humans have discovered to their sorrow throughout all of history. It grows in darkness, feeding on fears and uncertainties, and the more Psyche tried to ignore it, the stronger it became, until she could think of nothing else. Every time her husband came to her in the darkness, every tender word he spoke and every gentle caress he bestowed, she found herself wondering, questioning, imagining. What if her sisters were right? What if the creature beside her in the darkness was indeed a monster, and every tender word was a lie, every gentle caress a manipulation? The oracle had not been wrong about her being brought to this place, so why assume it was wrong about the nature of her husband? And even if he was not a literal monster, even if he was exactly what he claimed to be, what kind of relationship could truly flourish in such absolute darkness, built on a foundation of blind obedience rather than mutual knowledge and understanding? These thoughts tormented her day and night, robbing her of the peace and happiness she had known, transforming her paradise into a gilded prison where she lived in constant uncertainty and fear. And all the while, her husband seemed to sense that something had changed between them. He held her more tightly in the darkness, spoke to her with greater urgency, warned her again and again not to listen to the poisonous words of those who would see her happiness destroyed. But these warnings, instead of reassuring her, only fed her doubt. Why was he so insistent that she not question him if he had nothing to hide? Why did he seem so afraid of her discovering the truth, if that truth was benign? The very intensity of his warnings became, in her confused and poisoned thoughts, evidence of guilt rather than love. For several nights, Psyche wrestled with these questions, torn between love and doubt, between trust and curiosity, between obedience and the need to know. She would lie in her husband's arms after making love, feeling his heart beating against her cheek, and she would think, surely this tenderness cannot be false, surely this connection we share is real and true. But then the doubts would return, whispers in her mind that sounded disturbingly like her sisters' voices, and she would wonder again, unable to find peace. And in the end, curiosity and fear proved stronger than trust, as they so often do in the stories humans tell about themselves, stories that serve as warnings but which we rarely seem to heed until it is too late. One night, when her husband's breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, when she was certain he would not wake, Psyche made her terrible decision. She slipped carefully from the bed, moving with infinite care to avoid disturbing the sleeping god beside her, and retrieved the lamp and knife she had hidden as her sisters had instructed. Her hands shook as she struck the flint and lit the wick, her heart hammering so loudly in her chest that she was certain it would wake her sleeping husband and end this mad enterprise before it truly began. But he did not wake, not immediately, and the lamplight bloomed in the darkness of the chamber, pushing back the shadows that had hidden him from her all these weeks and months, revealing at last the form and face of the husband she had known only through touch and voice and scent. And what Psyche saw in that moment of revelation shocked her so profoundly that she nearly dropped both the lamp and the knife, so stunned was she by the reality that lay before her, so completely opposite to everything her sisters had led her to fear. There was no monster in her bed, no serpent with scales gleaming like armor, no dragon with fangs and claws, no creature of nightmare and dark legend. Instead, lying before her in the golden lamplight was the most beautiful being she had ever beheld in her life, so perfect in every detail that he seemed not quite real, as though he were a statue carved by a master sculptor at the absolute height of his powers and then brought to life by some impossible magic. He was young, eternally youthful in the way that only immortals can be, his features flawless in their symmetry and proportion. Golden curls tumbled across his forehead, catching the lamplight and seeming to glow from within with their own radiance. His skin was smooth and unblemished, with the particular quality of luminescence that marked him as divine, as something more than merely mortal. Even in sleep, his face held an expression of such sweetness and nobility that it made Psyche's heart ache to look at him, to think that this beautiful being had chosen her, had loved her, had defied the gods themselves to make her his wife. Most telling of all, most definitive in identifying exactly what manner of being shared her bed, were the great white wings that lay folded against his back, their feathers soft and luminous as new snow, stirring slightly with each breath he took. These were not the wings of any earthly bird, but the wings of a god, wings that could carry him from earth to heaven and back again, wings that marked him as one of the immortal powers that ruled over aspects of human existence. Psyche knew with sudden, absolute certainty who lay before her. This was Eros, the god of love himself, the son of Aphrodite, one of the most powerful and most widely worshipped of all the Olympian deities. He could have had any goddess or nymph in all creation, could have commanded the devotion and desire of immortal beings of surpassing beauty and power, and yet he had chosen her, a mortal woman, to be his wife. The revelation was so stunning, so completely opposite to what her sisters had led her to fear, that Psyche stood frozen for a long moment, the lamp still held aloft, unable to process what she was seeing or to fully comprehend the implications of this discovery. Relief flooded through her first, the overwhelming joy of learning that her sisters had been catastrophically wrong, that her husband was not a monster, but a god, not something to fear, but something to revere. But that relief was almost immediately followed by a new and different kind of terror. If her husband was indeed Eros, then his warnings about the consequences of looking upon him took on new and far more serious implications. This was not merely a request for privacy or the quirk of an eccentric personality. This was a divine prohibition, backed by powers beyond mortal comprehension, and she had just violated it in the most complete and deliberate way possible. Psyche stood there beside the bed, transfixed by the beauty of the god who had been her husband, her mind racing through all the implications of what she had done and what she now knew, and in her distraction, in her shock and wonder and dawning horror, she allowed the lamp to tilt slightly in her trembling hand. disaster struck in the form of a single drop of hot oil that spilled from the lamp's reservoir, falling through the air to land with terrible precision on Eros's bare shoulder. The burning droplet seared into his divine flesh, and the god woke with a cry of pain and betrayal that echoed through the chamber like a physical force. His eyes, when they opened and focused on Psyche standing over him with the lamp in one hand and the knife in the other, held a sorrow so deep and so profound that it cut into her soul like the blade she had brought to slay him. She saw in those eyes the death of trust, the shattering of hope, the end of something beautiful that could never be rebuilt in quite the same way. He sat up, one hand going to the burn on his shoulder where already a blister was beginning to form, a mark of her distrust branded into his immortal flesh that would remain until it chose to heal. When he spoke, his voice was no longer warm with affection or tender with desire, but cold with hurt and disappointment and the terrible weariness of one who has risked everything and lost. "Psyche," he said, and her name in his mouth now sounded like an accusation, like a lament for something precious that had been carelessly destroyed. "After all my warnings, after all the times I begged you to trust me, after all my love for you and everything I gave you and every way I tried to show you how much you meant to me, you could not do it. You could not simply believe that I loved you and wanted your happiness. You had to know, had to see, had to question and doubt and betray the one promise I asked you to keep." He rose from the bed, his wings spreading wide behind him, filling the chamber with their radiance, making the lamplight seem dim and pitiful by comparison. Psyche stepped back, the lamp falling from her nerveless fingers to shatter on the floor, the knife clattering beside it, both now revealed as unnecessary and foolish, weapons brought to fight a threat that had never existed. "Do you know who I am, Psyche?" Eros asked, though clearly the question was rhetorical, for she could see in his eyes that he knew she had recognized him. "Do you understand now what you have done? I am Eros, the god of love itself, and I fell in love with you when I was supposed to curse you at my mother's command. I defied divine law to be with you. I risked my mother's wrath and the disapproval of all Olympus to make you my wife, and this is how you repay that love, with suspicion and disobedience and betrayal." Psyche tried to speak, tried to explain about her sisters and their poisonous words, tried to apologize and beg for forgiveness and make him understand that she had acted out of fear and manipulation rather than out of any lack of love for him. But her voice came out as barely a whisper, choked by tears and shame and the crushing weight of what she had done. Eros was already moving toward the window, his wings spreading wider for flight, his body tensing in preparation for departure. "I warned you," he said, his voice breaking with grief that made Psyche's heart shatter in her chest. "I told you what would happen if you violated my trust, and you chose not to believe me, chose to listen to your sister's poison instead of to my love. Now you will learn the truth of my words, will discover what it means to lose what you had." He paused at the window, looking back at her one last time, and the expression on his face was so full of sorrow and loss and disappointed love that Psyche wanted to die right there, wanted the earth to open and swallow her whole, rather than have to endure the sight of what her foolishness had destroyed. "Goodbye, Psyche," Eros said softly. "May you find happiness in the knowledge you so desperately sought, for you will find it nowhere else. Love cannot exist without trust, and you have proven that your trust in me was not strong enough to overcome the first real test it faced." And with that, he was gone, launching himself through the window and into the night sky, his great wings carrying him away with powerful beats that stirred the air and made the curtains billow, leaving Psyche alone in the chamber with the shattered lamp and the knife and the crushing weight of her own monumental mistake. The palace around her, which had seemed so alive with magic and possibility just moments before, now felt hollow and dead, as though the very life had been drained from it along with Eros's departure. The invisible servants, if they were still present, made no sound and offered no comfort. The beauty that surrounded her seemed to mock her now, a reminder of everything she had possessed and so carelessly thrown away. Psyche stood there for a long moment, frozen in shock and grief, unable to process the magnitude of what had just happened, unable to fully comprehend that in a single moment of weakness and doubt she had destroyed everything that mattered. Then the full reality of it crashed over her like a wave, and she collapsed to her knees, weeping with a grief so profound that it felt as though it would tear her apart from the inside. She wept until she had no tears left, and then she wept dry sobs that shook her body and made her ribs ache, and when even that was exhausted, she lay on the floor beside the broken lamp and wished with all her heart that she could die, that she could simply stop existing rather than have to live with the knowledge of what her foolishness and her lack of trust had cost her. After what might have been hours or might have been days, for time seemed to have lost all meaning in her grief, Psyche dragged herself to her feet. If she could not die, if she had to continue existing in this world of pain and loss and regret, then she would at least try to make amends, would attempt to win back the love she had so carelessly thrown away, or die in the attempt. She made her way to the window through which Eros had departed and threw herself after him, hoping either to catch him or to end her own life in the fall, almost indifferent to which outcome resulted. But even in his anger and his hurt, Eros must have been watching over her, or perhaps the world itself took pity on her grief, because Psyche did not fall to her death on the rocks below the palace. Instead, she tumbled into a bed of soft grass at the palace's base, bruised and shaken but alive, her body intact even if her heart and spirit felt irreparably broken. She lay there weeping until she had no tears left, and then she lay there longer still, numb with misery and self-recrimination, staring up at the stars that had witnessed her fall and offered no comfort or guidance. When she finally dragged herself to her feet and looked back at where the palace had stood, she found that it had vanished, dissolved like a dream at waking, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. She stood in an ordinary meadow under an ordinary sky, surrounded by ordinary flowers and ordinary grass, and everything that had made her life beautiful and strange and full of love had been stripped away, leaving her with nothing but her grief and her guilt and a determination, slowly forming in her devastated heart to somehow make amends for what she had done or die trying. The journey back to the mortal world was long and difficult, and when Psyche finally reached civilization again, she learned what had become of her sisters, those architects of her misery. She had visited each of them in turn, appearing at their palaces as a ghost from their shared past, and she had told them a carefully crafted lie designed to punish them for their malicious manipulation. She told them that Eros had indeed been angry with her for looking upon his face, but that in his divine anger he had declared he would take one of her sisters as his wife instead. She described how Zephyrus would come to carry the chosen sister to the palace if she would only go to the mountain peak from which Psyche herself had been carried and call for the west wind to bear her away to her new divine husband. Her sisters, consumed with jealousy and ambition and the desperate desire to claim for themselves the divine husband and magical palace they had seen, had eagerly rushed to the mountain. Each one had stood at the summit and called for Zephyrus to carry them to their new life as a god's wife, and each one had thrown herself from the cliff in expectation of being caught and borne away on gentle breezes. But Zephyrus had not come for them. No divine wind had caught them in mid-fall. They had plummeted onto the rocks below, their bodies broken, their scheming ended, their punishment for their cruel manipulation of their sister complete and final and irrevocable. Psyche felt no joy in their deaths, only a hollow satisfaction that justice, of a sort, had been served. But she knew that punishing her sisters did nothing to address her real problem, which was that she had betrayed the trust of the one being in all the world who had truly loved her, and she had no idea how to make that right, or whether making it right was even possible. And so her true journey began, a quest not for treasure or glory or power, but for redemption and forgiveness, and the chance to prove that her love was real and deep enough to overcome even her own terrible mistake. It would be a journey that would take her to places no mortal had ever ventured, would require her to face trials that would test every aspect of her courage and her devotion, and would ultimately transform her from a mortal girl into something far greater, into a being worthy of the impossible love she had won and lost, and would, through suffering and persistence and the deepest kind of courage, win again. What Psyche did not understand, in those first days when crowds began to gather outside her father's palace, in those first moments when whispers of comparison to Aphrodite began to circulate like dangerous rumors carried on the wind, was the radical nature of her predicament. This was not a situation of her own making, not the consequence of pride or ambition or any deliberate attempt to claim divinity for herself. Unlike the countless mortals who had suffered divine wrath for their hubris, for climbing too high or claiming too much or daring to challenge the gods in contests of skill or beauty, Psyche had done nothing. She had committed no act of defiance, spoken no boastful words, made no claims to divine status or supernatural gifts. Her only crime, if it could even be called a crime, was simply existing with a beauty so profound that others, in their enthusiasm and their need for something to worship, had elevated her beyond the bounds of mortality without her permission or participation. This is what makes her story so different from the cautionary tales of hubris that fill the pages of mythology, so distinct from the narratives of mortals who knew they were transgressing and did so anyway. Arachne had challenged Athena to a weaving contest, openly declaring herself the superior artist. Niobe had boasted of her 14 children and mocked Leto for having only 2, though those 2 happened to be Apollo and Artemis. Marsyas had dared to claim his musical skill surpassed that of Apollo himself. These mortals had agency in their destruction, had made choices that led directly to divine punishment, had in some sense earned their terrible fates through their own arrogance and poor judgment. But Psyche was different. Psyche was passive in her own elevation, a beautiful object around which others constructed their worship, a vessel into which people poured their devotion without ever asking whether she desired such attention or whether she had any control over the extraordinary gift of beauty that had been bestowed upon her at birth. She had not asked to be more beautiful than Aphrodite. She had not cultivated her appearance beyond the normal grooming expected of a princess. She had not encouraged the worship that grew up around her, had in fact been increasingly uncomfortable with it as it intensified and took on more religious overtones. And yet, it was Psyche who would pay the price for others' choices, Psyche who would face divine wrath for a transgression she had never committed. This is the terrifying heart of her story's beginning, the element that sets it apart from other myths and makes it resonate with a particular kind of injustice that feels profoundly human and profoundly unfair. Sometimes the story whispers to us across the millennia, you can do everything right and still be punished. Sometimes your very existence, through no fault of your own, can become a threat to powers beyond your control or comprehension. Sometimes beauty itself, that quality so praised and desired in our world, can become a curse more terrible than any ugliness. For Aphrodite, however, the situation looked entirely different, and understanding her perspective is crucial to comprehending why she reacted with such fury and why this particular mortal girl represented such a profound threat. This was not merely about vanity, though vanity certainly played its part in the goddess's response. This was about something far more fundamental to divine existence, something that modern readers living in a world where gods have largely retreated into metaphor and symbol might struggle to fully grasp. The gods of Olympus were not, in the Greek understanding, omnipotent beings who existed independent of mortal belief and worship. They were powerful, certainly, and immortal in ways that mortals could never be, but their power was sustained and strengthened by the devotion of those who worshipped them. Prayers were not just words spoken into the void, they were sustenance, feeding divine power, the way that food feeds mortal bodies. Sacrifices were not merely symbolic gestures, but actual transfers of energy from the mortal to the divine realm, strengthening the gods and maintaining the cosmic order that kept all of creation functioning as it should. When worshippers began to neglect Aphrodite's altars, when they stopped bringing offerings to her temples, when they transferred their devotion from the divine goddess of beauty to a mortal girl who happened to possess extraordinary physical loveliness, they were not just insulting Aphrodite's pride. They were actively diminishing her power, weakening her position among the Olympians, threatening her very existence in ways that a mortal monarch might be threatened by subjects who stopped paying taxes and began sending their resources to a rival claimant to the throne. And there was precedent for divine beings losing their power when worship ceased. The older gods, the Titans whom the Olympians had overthrown, had once been supreme but were now imprisoned or diminished, their power broken not just by military defeat but by the withdrawal of worship as humans transferred their devotion to the newer, more vital deities. Aphrodite could see in the empty temples and cold altars the first stages of her own potential obsolescence, the beginning of a slide toward irrelevance that could, if left unchecked, result in her losing everything that made her who and what she was. So her rage, when it finally crystallized into action, was not the petty tantrum of a vain woman angry that someone was prettier than her. It was the cold fury of a being facing an existential threat. A goddess fighting for her survival and her relevance in a cosmos where power was fluid and worship was currency and nothing, not even immortality, was truly guaranteed. She was fighting not just to maintain her position but to send a message to any other mortal who might think to usurp divine prerogatives, to remind the world that beauty belonged to her domain and her alone, and that mortals who trespassed on that territory, whether deliberately or accidentally, would face consequences severe enough to deter future transgressions. This context transforms our understanding of Aphrodite's actions from simple villainy to something more complex and, in its own terrible way, comprehensible. She was defending herself and her domain using the only means available to her, wielding her power to eliminate a threat that could, if left unchecked, have destroyed her as surely as any weapon or poison. That her methods were cruel, that they targeted an innocent girl who had done nothing to deserve such treatment, was unfortunate from Aphrodite's perspective, but ultimately irrelevant. The gods, as countless myths remind us, were not particularly concerned with fairness or justice when their own interests were at stake. They were concerned with power and with maintaining the hierarchies that gave their existence meaning and substance. And so Psyche found herself caught in forces far beyond her understanding or control, a mortal pawn in a divine conflict she had not instigated and could not escape, trapped by her own beauty in a way that made that beauty not a blessing but a curse of the most profound kind. She was too beautiful to be allowed to live a normal mortal life, but not powerful enough to defend herself against the divine forces that her beauty had inadvertently provoked. She existed in a terrible liminal space between mortality and divinity, elevated by human worship but lacking any of the protections or powers that true godhood would have provided, vulnerable in ways that would have made her fate tragic even if Eros had never entered the picture to complicate everything with the addition of genuine love. The oracle's pronouncement, when it came, had been carefully crafted to serve multiple purposes, and understanding its complexity helps illuminate the intricate divine politics at work behind the scenes of Psyche's suffering. On the surface, it appeared to be a straightforward doom, a prediction that Psyche would be claimed by a monster and taken from the mortal world. But the oracle spoke Apollo's truth, and Apollo, though he owed certain allegiances to his fellow Olympians, was also known for his cryptic pronouncements that could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on the knowledge and perspective of the interpreter. When the oracle spoke of a winged serpent feared by gods and mortals alike, she was telling the truth, but it was a truth that would only become clear in retrospect. Eros, with his ability to make anyone, mortal or immortal, fall helplessly in love, was indeed feared by gods and mortals, for love was a force that could upset carefully laid plans, that could make the powerful vulnerable and the rational irrational, that could reach into the heart and remake it without permission or warning. His wings marked him as something other than fully human, and the ancient Greeks, in their poetry and their art, sometimes did refer to Eros in serpentine terms, describing his influence as something that coiled around the heart and could not be easily escaped once it had taken hold. But to Psyche's family, lacking this divine context, lacking any way to understand the multiple layers of meaning embedded in the oracle's words, the pronouncement sounded like nothing more than a death sentence wrapped in mystical language. They heard monster and feared by all, and winged serpent, and their minds filled with images of the creatures from their darkest myths, beings of genuine horror that preyed on humans and brought only suffering and death. They could not imagine that the oracle was actually describing their daughter's future husband, that this terrifying prophecy was really, in its own convoluted way, a promise of love rather than a threat of destruction. In the mountain peak ceremony, in that terrible conflation of wedding and funeral, we see another layer of the story's psychological complexity. Psyche was being dressed as a bride for a marriage that everyone believed would end in her death, creating a ritual that was neither one thing nor the other, but a grotesque hybrid of both. This was not the joyful transition that marriage was supposed to represent, the movement from one household to another, from girlhood to womanhood, from being a daughter to being a wife, and potentially a mother. Instead, it was a ritual sacrifice disguised as a wedding, an offering of a young woman's life to appease forces beyond mortal control. And yet Psyche accepted it, found in herself a core of courage that allowed her to walk to what she believed was her death with dignity and grace. This was not the courage of a warrior facing battle, knowing that skill and strength might prevail. This was not the courage of a hero embarking on a quest, aware that cleverness and divine favor might see them through to triumph. This was the darker courage of acceptance, the strength required to face inevitable doom without collapsing into hysteria or despair, to maintain human dignity even when all hope has been stripped away. She had lived her entire life as an object of admiration and worship, elevated above normal human connection, and in facing what she thought was her death, she found a kind of freedom in letting all that go. If beauty had been her prison, then death would be release. If worship had been the barrier between her and genuine human connection, then the ending of her life would at least mean the ending of that terrible isolation. There was, in her acceptance of the oracle's doom, a resignation that looked almost like relief, a willingness to embrace whatever came next, because it could hardly be worse than the strange half-life she had been living, adored but not loved, worshipped but not known. When Zephyrus carried her from the mountain peak, when the west wind wrapped around her in that gentle, careful embrace and bore her through the darkness to the impossible palace that awaited below, the transition was more than just a physical journey from one place to another. It was a crossing of thresholds, a passage from the mortal world with its hard edges and harsh realities into a realm where magic was commonplace and the impossible was merely another word for the everyday. Psyche was being carried not just through space, but between worlds, from the realm of mortals into a space that existed in the margins between human and divine, a place that belonged fully to neither but drew from both. The meadow where Zephyrus set her down was not anywhere that could be found on mortal maps, was not accessible by any road that human feet could walk. It existed in one of those pocket realms that the gods could create when they chose, spaces carved out of reality's fabric and maintained by divine will, subject to laws that their creators determined rather than to the natural laws that governed the rest of creation. This was Eros's private sanctuary, built for the purpose of housing the mortal woman he loved, designed to give her everything she might need or desire, while keeping her separate from both the mortal world she had left and the divine world to which she could not yet belong. The palace itself, with its golden walls and jeweled pillars, its impossible luxuries, and its atmosphere of almost conscious care, was not just a dwelling place, but a kind of love letter rendered in physical form. Every detail had been chosen to please Psyche specifically, to provide comfort and beauty and stimulation in exactly the forms and proportions that would most appeal to her particular tastes and temperament. The invisible servants were not merely convenient magical constructs, but careful buffers between Psyche and the harsh truth of her situation, allowing her to be cared for without having to interact with divine beings who might inadvertently reveal too much about her husband's true nature. Everything about the palace and the life Eros had constructed for Psyche there was designed to create a perfect bubble of happiness, a space where she could simply exist without the burden of worship or the complications of divine politics or the thousand small difficulties that attend normal mortal existence. It was, in its own way, a kind of Eden, a paradise carefully constructed and maintained, wanting only the presence of the beloved to make it complete. But like Eden, this paradise contained within it the seeds of its own destruction, the flaw that would ultimately bring the whole beautiful construction crashing down. And that flaw was not malicious or deliberately introduced, it was simply the inevitable consequence of trying to build perfect happiness on a foundation that required one party to remain in ignorance. No matter how beautiful the palace, no matter how attentive the care, no matter how genuine the love that had motivated its creation, the simple fact that Eros insisted on remaining invisible, on being known only in darkness, created a void at the center of Psyche's new life, a missing piece that all the luxury in the world could not replace. In stories of captive princesses and imprisoned maidens, the ones that echo through every culture's folklore and mythology, there is usually a clear villain, a captor who is unambiguously wrong in their actions, whose motives are selfish or cruel or predatory. But Psyche's situation in Eros's palace complicates that narrative in profound ways. She was not imprisoned in any conventional sense. The palace had no locks on its doors, no guards preventing her from leaving, no chains or bars or physical restraints of any kind. She could wander freely through the gardens, could move through any room she chose, could spend her days exactly as she wished, without interference or restriction. The constraint placed upon her was not physical but perceptual, not about where she could go or what she could do, but about what she was allowed to know. And this makes all the difference in understanding the psychological complexity of her situation. Eros's demand that she never look upon his face was not, from his perspective, cruel control or unreasonable domination. It was what he believed was a necessary protection, a boundary required to preserve both her safety and their love in the face of divine politics that she could not comprehend and dangers she could not appreciate. From his point of view, Psyche's ignorance of his true identity was the only thing standing between her and his mother's wrath. If Aphrodite learned that he had not just failed to curse Psyche as commanded, but had actually married her, had elevated this rival beauty to the status of a goddess's daughter-in-law, the consequences would be catastrophic. Aphrodite's rage would know no bounds, and Psyche, as a mortal, would be utterly defenseless against whatever revenge the goddess might devise. Better, Eros reasoned, to keep Psyche in loving ignorance, to let her believe she had married some nameless divine being rather than the son of the very goddess whose worship she had inadvertently usurped. But from Psyche's perspective, trapped inside the situation without access to this crucial context, the prohibition felt very different. It felt like mistrust, like a suggestion that she was not worthy of full knowledge, like a barrier erected between her and true intimacy with her husband. How could she fully know someone she had never seen? How could she trust completely in someone who insisted on maintaining such absolute secrecy? The very intensity of Eros's insistence that she never look upon him, the urgency of his warnings about the dire consequences that would follow if she violated this single rule, paradoxically served to undermine rather than strengthen her ability to simply accept and trust. This was the test of faith that the invisible husband represented, a trial more subtle and more psychologically complex than any physical ordeal could have been. Could Psyche learn to love and trust based purely on experiences of kindness, on the quality of conversation in darkness, on the gentleness of touch and the warmth of presence, without the visual confirmation that humans so deeply rely on for assessing trustworthiness and sincerity? Could she accept that some things must remain mysteries, that perfect knowledge is not always possible or even desirable, that faith sometimes requires surrendering the need to understand everything? These are philosophical questions as much as personal ones, touching on fundamental issues about the nature of trust and knowledge and love that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of this particular myth. They ask us to consider what we truly need to know about another person in order to love them fully, whether sight is actually necessary for genuine intimacy, whether knowledge and trust are complementary or potentially contradictory forces in relationships. They ask whether demanding absolute transparency from our partners represents healthy communication, or whether it might sometimes represent an unwillingness to accept the fundamental unknowability that exists at the core of every human soul, the private interior spaces that can never be fully revealed, no matter how much we might long to breach them. When the invisible servants attended to Psyche's needs, when she felt gentle touches guiding her through the palace but could see no hands performing those touches, when voices spoke to her from empty air offering comfort and assistance and care, she was experiencing a kind of relationship stripped of all visual cues, forced to rely entirely on other senses and on her own intuitive responses to assess the quality of care being provided. And by all accounts, that care was perfect, attentive beyond anything mortal servants could have provided, anticipating needs before she fully articulated them, creating an environment of such seamless comfort that she barely had to think about practical matters at all. But perfection has its own alienating quality. When everything is provided without effort, when every need is met before you have to ask, when the mechanics of daily life become invisible because they are handled by invisible servants with invisible efficiency, there can be a strange sense of unreality that creeps in, a feeling of being disconnected from the normal chains of cause and effect that govern embodied existence. Psyche lived in an environment where she never had to cook a meal or draw water or tend to any of the thousand small practical tasks that fill mortal days. And while this freedom from drudgery was in many ways wonderful, it also contributed to the dreamlike, unmoored quality of her existence in the palace, the sense that she was living in a beautiful bubble separate from any reality she could fully understand or relate to. So the invisible husband and the invisible servants together created an environment that was simultaneously the most comfortable Psyche had ever experienced and also profoundly isolating in its perfection, providing everything except the grounding presence of other visible, embodied beings with whom she could interact in the ways humans are accustomed to interacting. It was luxury that carried within it the seeds of loneliness, comfort that came at the cost of genuine connection with others beyond her mysterious husband who visited only in darkness. And this is why, when her sister's poison finally took root in her mind, when their suggestions about monstrous husbands and terrible secrets found purchase in the small doubts that had been accumulating despite all Eros's love and care, Psyche was more vulnerable than she might have been in a less perfect but more comprehensible environment. The very extremity of her situation, the supernatural quality of her daily life, made it easier rather than harder to believe that something was profoundly wrong, that such unusual circumstances must surely conceal some dark secret that would explain why her husband insisted on remaining unseen. The 4 impossible tasks that Aphrodite would eventually assign to Psyche, those trials that would come after everything had fallen apart, and Psyche found herself desperately seeking to make amends for her betrayal of trust, were not arbitrary cruelties chosen at random by a vindictive goddess looking to torment a mortal who had offended her. They were carefully selected tests, each one designed to force Psyche to develop specific qualities and to undergo specific transformations that would prepare her for the role she would ultimately need to fulfill, that would change her from a mortal woman whose only notable quality was physical beauty into something far more substantial, into a being capable of standing as an equal partner to a god, rather than as his beautiful but ultimately inadequate mortal bride. The first task, sorting an enormous mixed pile of grains into separate heaps by type before dawn, was on its surface an exercise in tedium and impossibility, the kind of labour that would require hundreds of hands working in perfect coordination to accomplish in the time allowed. But symbolically, it represented something far more significant. It was about learning to bring order to chaos, to find patterns in what appeared to be formless confusion, to distinguish between things that might look similar but were actually fundamentally different. It was about developing the patience and the careful attention to detail required to solve problems that cannot be rushed or simplified, that demand methodical work and sustained focus even when the task seems overwhelming. Psyche could not have completed this task when she first arrived at Eros's palace, when she was still the pampered princess who had never had to struggle or strive for anything, who had been given everything beautiful and comfortable without effort. She needed first to experience loss and desperation, needed to be stripped of the magical luxury that had surrounded and sustained her, needed to find herself alone and bereft with no divine assistance to rely on. Only then, when she understood what it meant to face impossible odds with only her own determination and whatever help she could find, could she truly appreciate what the task was teaching her and develop the qualities it was meant to instill. The second task, gathering golden wool from violent, sun-maddened rams without being trampled or gored by their aggression, was about learning to approach dangerous power with intelligence rather than with direct confrontation. The rams, with their golden fleece gleaming in the sunlight, represented divine forces that could not be overcome through mortal strength alone, that would destroy anyone foolish enough to try to meet them head-on. But their violence was not constant. It waxed and waned with the sun's position, becoming most intense in the heat of noon and gentling as afternoon faded toward evening. The lesson here was about timing and patience, about understanding that some objectives cannot be achieved by direct action but require waiting for the right moment, approaching from an angle, using cleverness rather than confrontation. It was about learning to assess situations accurately, to understand when retreat is wisdom rather than cowardice, to know that gathering wool from branches where the rams had left it was just as valid as taking it directly from the animals' backs, that success is not diminished by being achieved through indirect means rather than through dramatic heroism. This was a lesson in humility, in accepting that mortals must sometimes be subtle where gods can be bold, that strength comes in many forms, and the strength to wait and observe and act strategically is no less valuable than the strength to fight directly. The third task, collecting water from the river Styx where it cascaded down from impossible heights, guarded by dragons and flowing through terrain so treacherous that no mortal could possibly navigate it, was perhaps the most explicitly about confronting divine power and the vast gulf between mortal and immortal capability. The Styx was the river of oaths that bound even the gods, the boundary between life and death, a force of such cosmic significance that to even approach it required traversing the boundaries of the known world and venturing into spaces where mortals were never meant to go. This task forced Psyche to confront her own mortality and insignificance in the face of powers beyond her comprehension, to accept help from unexpected sources in the form of Zeus's eagle who took pity on her and accomplished the task she could not complete herself, to understand that sometimes succeeding requires acknowledging our own limitations and accepting assistance from those more capable. It was a lesson in humility of a different kind, a recognition that we cannot always accomplish everything through our own efforts alone, that knowing when to ask for help or to accept help when it is offered is not weakness but wisdom. And the fourth task, descending into the underworld itself to retrieve a box of beauty from Persephone for Aphrodite's use, was the ultimate trial, the culmination of all the lessons that had come before, and the final test that would determine whether Psyche had truly been transformed by her ordeal into someone capable of transcending her mortal limitations. To enter the realm of the dead while still living, to walk the paths that the dead walk and breathe the air of that sunless realm and return again to the world of light, this was to confront death itself, to face the fundamental boundary that separates mortal from immortal existence and find a way to cross it in both directions. The descent into the underworld is one of the most powerful and recurring motifs in mythology, appearing in stories from cultures around the world, and it always represents the same essential journey, a movement down into darkness and death and the deepest, most terrifying parts of human existence, and then, crucially, a return, a resurrection, a proving that one is stronger than death itself, capable of descending and yet not being held, of touching the realm of the dead and yet remaining among the living. Those who accomplish this feat are transformed by it, are never again quite what they were before, carry within them something of that darkness they have witnessed and survived. For Psyche, the descent meant walking through landscapes of ash and shadow, past the shades of the dead who would plead for her help or try to delay her journey, resisting every temptation to deviate from her path or to show pity that would trap her in the underworld forever. It meant approaching Persephone, queen of the dead, in her dark palace and making her request with perfect courtesy and proper offerings, treating the goddess with the respect due to her station despite the terror that must have filled Psyche's mortal heart at being in such a place, so far from sunlight and life and everything that defined her existence. And it meant, crucially, resisting the temptation to open the box of beauty that Persephone gave her, to peek inside at the contents, to use for herself what was meant for Aphrodite. This final temptation would prove to be the one that Psyche, having successfully completed everything else, would fail, and that failure is itself instructive, a reminder that transformation is not complete in a single moment, that old habits and old weaknesses can resurface even after we think we have overcome them, that the journey toward becoming our best selves is ongoing rather than something that can be definitively completed. When Psyche, exhausted from her trials and still bearing the scars of all she had endured, succumbed to the temptation to open the box, hoping perhaps to restore some of the beauty that her suffering had dimmed, she found not beauty inside but a sleep like death, a darkness that claimed her and pulled her down into unconsciousness that would have been permanent had Eros not intervened. This was her final failure, and paradoxically also her final success, because it was this act of very human weakness, this inability to resist temptation even after everything she had learned, that finally moved Eros to act on her behalf, to appeal to Zeus for permission to make her immortal, to transform their tragic love story into something with a happy ending that almost no other myth in the Greek canon could claim. The happy ending of Psyche and Eros' story is so unusual in Greek mythology that it deserves its own examination, its own exploration of why this particular tale was granted the grace of resolution, where so many others ended in tragedy and suffering. Greek myths are not generally known for their gentle conclusions. They tend toward catastrophe, toward lovers separated forever, toward heroes destroyed by their own flaws or by the machinations of capricious gods, toward the triumph of fate over hope, and the grinding weight of destiny crushing human aspiration. The Greeks understood tragedy deeply and explored it thoroughly in their stories, finding in the contemplation of suffering and loss a kind of terrible beauty and profound truth about the human condition. But the story of Psyche and Eros, as told by the Roman writer Apuleius in his work The Golden Ass, breaks this pattern decisively and deliberately. It gives us not tragedy, but comedy in the classical sense, not a story that descends into destruction, but one that ascends toward joy and reconciliation and the overcoming of all obstacles. It shows us a mortal woman who makes mistakes, who betrays trust, who fails repeatedly, and yet who is ultimately forgiven and elevated, granted the gift of immortality and formal acceptance into the divine family that had opposed her, given not just her husband back, but a permanent place beside him that can never be taken away. This ascension to godhood, this apotheosis that transforms Psyche from mortal woman into immortal deity through the drinking of ambrosia at Zeus's command, is the climax toward which the entire story has been building, the transformation that all the trials and suffering have been preparing her to receive. It is Zeus who makes this possible, Zeus who looks at the situation and sees not just a sordid affair between a god and a mortal or a mother-son conflict that needs resolution, but something more profound, a love that has been tested thoroughly and found genuine, a mortal who has proven through her trials that she possesses qualities worthy of immortality. When Zeus commands that ambrosia be brought and given to Psyche to drink, when he decrees that her marriage to Eros will be formalized and made official, recognized by all the Olympians, including the initially resistant Aphrodite, he is not just solving a family dispute or granting a favor to Eros. He is recognizing that Psyche has earned her elevation through suffering and persistence and genuine love, that she has been transformed by her trials into something more than the merely beautiful mortal she began as, that she has developed the wisdom and strength and depth of character required to stand as an equal among the immortals rather than as a mortal novelty or a god's temporary plaything. The ambrosia, that food of the gods which grants immortality to any mortal who consumes it, is more than just a magical substance that alters physical form. It represents acceptance into the divine community, transformation at the most fundamental level from something that must die into something that cannot die, elevation from the realm of time and change and inevitable decay into the realm of eternal youth and perpetual existence. When Psyche drinks the ambrosia and feels it working through her body, changing her at some essential level beyond the merely physical, she is completing the transformation that began when she first betrayed Eros's trust and lost his palace, that continued through all her trials and sufferings, that culminates now in this moment of divine acceptance and immortal transformation. And crucially, this happy ending is not presented as unearned or as the result of mere divine whim. Psyche has worked for this conclusion, has suffered for it, has proven through ordeal after ordeal that she possesses the qualities required to deserve it. Her apotheosis is a reward not just for her beauty, which she possessed from birth and which nearly destroyed her, but for her courage and persistence and willingness to endure whatever was necessary to make amends for her mistakes and to prove the genuineness of her love. She is given immortality not because a god wanted to keep a pretty mortal around, but because she has earned it through her own efforts and her own transformation from passive object of worship into active agent of her own destiny. The story becomes, in this reading, not a cautionary tale about the dangers of curiosity or a tragedy about trust betrayed, but something much more hopeful and redemptive. It becomes a story about how genuine love can survive and even be strengthened by betrayal if both parties are willing to work toward reconciliation, about how mistakes and failures are not necessarily final, about how transformation is possible even for those who seem to have lost everything, about how the human soul, when tested thoroughly, can prove itself worthy of elevation beyond mortality. The philosophical and allegorical dimensions of the Psyche and Eros myth extend far beyond the surface narrative of a beautiful woman and the god who loved her. The story, particularly as Apuleius tells it, is rich with symbolic meaning that operates on multiple levels simultaneously, offering both an entertaining romance and a profound meditation on the nature of the soul and its relationship to divine love. The name Psyche is not accidental. In Greek, psyche means soul, or breath, or life force, the essential animating principle that distinguishes the living from the dead, that which makes a human being more than just a collection of physical components arranged in humanoid form. By naming his protagonist Psyche, Apuleius is signaling explicitly that this story is not just about one particular woman, but about the human soul in general, about the journey that every soul must undertake in its movement from mortal ignorance toward divine understanding. Similarly, Eros represents not just romantic attraction, but love itself in its most cosmic and philosophical sense, the force that moves through all creation and that draws separate things together into unity, that creates bonds and connections and relationships, that transforms isolated individuals into couples and communities and societies. In Platonic philosophy, which heavily influenced Apuleius' thinking, love, or eros, was one of the fundamental forces of the cosmos, a principle as basic and as powerful as any physical law, driving the evolution and development of both individual souls and of reality as a whole. Read through this philosophical lens, the story becomes an allegory of the soul's journey toward union with divine love, a narrative about spiritual development and the trials that must be endured along that path. Psyche begins in ignorance, possessed of beauty but lacking wisdom or understanding, elevated by others' worship but not yet having earned that elevation through her own development. Her beauty represents the soul's inherent divine quality, the spark of the divine that exists in every human being, the potential for goodness and wisdom and connection that is present even before it has been fully developed or realized. Her marriage to Eros in darkness represents the soul's initial imperfect encounter with divine love, a connection that is genuine but limited by ignorance and lack of understanding. The soul experiences love's beneficence, receives love's gifts, knows love's presence, but does not yet fully comprehend what it is experiencing or why the connection takes the form it does. This limited understanding is necessary at first, protection against knowledge that the soul is not yet ready to receive, but it cannot be the final state if genuine union is to be achieved. The sisters represent the worldly influences that draw the soul away from its divine connection, the voices of materialistic thinking and shallow understanding that cannot comprehend spiritual realities and therefore interpret them in the most negative possible light. They are the parts of ourselves that doubt spiritual experience, that demand material proof of spiritual truths, that refuse to accept anything that cannot be seen and measured and rationally explained. Their poison is the poison of skepticism taken to destructive extremes, the rejection of faith in favor of sight, the demand for absolute knowledge where mystery might be more appropriate. Psyche's betrayal of Eros's trust, her act of looking upon him despite his prohibition, represents the soul's inevitable failure when it tries to grasp divine reality through purely rational means, when it refuses to accept that some truths must be approached through faith rather than through empirical investigation. The soul, unable to remain content with the experience of love without understanding love's nature, reaches for knowledge prematurely, and in the process loses the very connection it was trying to better understand. But this loss, this fall from grace, is not the end of the story, but rather the necessary precondition for what comes next. The soul, having lost its initial innocent connection with the divine through its own actions, must now consciously work to regain what it has lost, must undergo trials and purification, must develop wisdom and strength and humility through suffering. The 4 tasks become stages of spiritual development, each one representing a different aspect of the soul's purification and growth. Sorting the grains is learning to distinguish between thoughts and impulses, to separate the valuable from the worthless, to bring order to the chaos of unexamined mental and emotional life. Gathering the golden wool is learning to approach divine power with proper respect and timing rather than with presumption and arrogance. Collecting water from the sticks is confronting mortality and accepting help from divine grace when human effort proves insufficient. And descending to the underworld is the dark night of the soul, the journey through despair and death itself, the ultimate test that proves whether the soul has truly been transformed or whether it remains trapped in its mortal limitations. Psyche's final apotheosis, her transformation into an immortal goddess through drinking ambrosia, represents the soul's ultimate achievement of union with the divine, the completion of the spiritual journey that the entire story has been depicting. The soul, purified through trials, strengthened through suffering, humbled through failure and redeemed through persistence, finally achieves what it could not have achieved at the beginning: genuine, permanent, conscious union with divine love, not as an unequal partner but as a true spouse, not in ignorance but in full knowledge, not temporarily but eternally. And perhaps most significantly, the story insists that this transformation and union are possible not just for specially chosen heroes or for those of divine parentage, but for the human soul in general, for Psyche who represents all psyches, for the soul that exists in every human being. The message is one of hope and possibility, suggesting that every soul has the potential for this journey, that the trials we endure are not meaningless suffering, but opportunities for growth and transformation, that love and persistence and genuine desire for union with the divine can overcome even the most catastrophic mistakes and failures. This is why the story has resonated so powerfully across the centuries, why it has been retold and reinterpreted in countless forms, why it continues to speak to readers who might not share the specific philosophical and religious framework that Apuleius was working within. At its heart, it is a story about transformation and redemption, about love that survives testing, about the possibility of becoming more than we begin as, about the journey from ignorance to wisdom and from mortality to something that transcends death. These are themes that speak to fundamental human hopes and fears, that address questions about meaning and purpose and the ultimate destiny of the human soul that every culture and every individual must confront in some form. The story tells us that beauty alone is not enough, that even extraordinary beauty can become a curse without wisdom and strength to match it. It tells us that love requires trust, but that trust, once broken, can be repaired if both parties are willing to do the work required. It tells us that mistakes and failures are not necessarily final, that transformation is possible even after catastrophic loss, that the soul can endure trials that seem impossible and emerge stronger and wiser for having faced them. It tells us that the journey toward our best selves is difficult and painful and requires us to descend into our own darkness before we can ascend to light, but that the journey is worth taking, that the transformation is worth achieving, that union with divine love is possible for those willing to undergo whatever trials are necessary to attain it. And it gives us, in its happy ending, in its insistence that Psyche and Eros are ultimately united forever, in genuine partnership recognized by all the gods, a vision of hope that is all too rare in classical mythology, a promise that love and persistence and genuine transformation can overcome even divine opposition and mortal limitation. In a canon filled with tragic endings and doomed lovers, with heroes destroyed and maidens transformed into trees or stars or eternal sufferers as punishment for various transgressions, the story of Psyche and Eros stands as a remarkable exception, a myth that insists redemption is possible, that happy endings are achievable, that the soul can indeed win its union with love and live forever in that blessed state. This is the deeper truth that the story has carried across millennia, the reason why it continues to be told and retold, adapted and reimagined for new audiences and new contexts. It is a story about us, about the journey every soul undertakes, about the trials we all face, and the transformations we all must undergo if we are to become fully what we have the potential to become. It is a story about hope in the face of despair, about love surviving betrayal, about wisdom emerging from suffering, about mortal limitation transcended through divine grace and human persistence working in concert. And it is ultimately a story about the triumph of love, not the easy love that faces no obstacles, but the hard-won love that survives testing and emerges stronger and more genuine, more deeply rooted, more truly eternal than it could ever have been without those trials to prove and strengthen it. But that is a story for sleep to carry you through, a tale of trials and transformations that will unfold in your dreams as you rest, reminding you that even the greatest mistakes can be redeemed, that even the deepest wounds can heal, and that love, when it is true and tested through fire, can transform even the mortal into the divine.